Joseph Ratzinger and other scholars do this. They say the data we have for the resurrection can be divided into two categories: confessional and narrative. We have documents in the first century which confess it. We'll look at that. We have documents which give a narrative of it. We'll look briefly at that. The first source we have is from St. Paul, who I said writes in the mid-50s. I want to highlight the confessional proclamation of the resurrection is summed up in what's called the kerygma. I didn't put it on there, but if I had PowerPoint working, you'd see it. It's K-E-R-Y-G-M-A. K-E-R-Y-G-M-A. Kerygma. It comes from the Greek word to proclaim or to call out. It's the nugget, kind of nuclear proclamation of this Christian nugget. You see it in different places in the gospel. Let me just read to you this kerygma as a confessional statement of Christ's resurrection. And this is dating back to the 50s or 60s. It's from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. And I want to point out some key elements from this. This is where the 7 key elements from this confessional. We're just going to look at this basic point. You'll see this in other confessional areas. In the Acts of the Apostles, like when Peter stands up and he just proclaims it, that this Jesus is risen from the dead, and elements of that. Let me just highlight this part right here. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 8. Now I am reminding you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you indeed received and in which you also stand. Through it you are also being saved if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. Now here comes these 3 verses, which Paul himself, scholars say, he didn't write. I mean, he wrote it, but he didn't originally make them up. He just received them, because he says, I received this. And these 3 verses predate the year 50. It's at least from the year 50 and probably from the 40s or earlier. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still living, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as one born abnormally, he appeared to me. Let me just highlight 7 points from that, kind of draw them out. The first one is the saving efficacy of Christ's death and his resurrection. The saving efficacy. These events have a saving power of some kind for Paul. The second one, second key point, that the death and resurrection of Christ are in accord with God's plan, expressed in Judaism. You can see that when Paul says, in fulfillment of the Scriptures, or according to the Scriptures, is God's plan. Again, we're laying out basic elements of the kerygma, or of this confessional claim in the resurrection. The third point, the faith of the early church in the resurrection was rooted in the testimony of those to whom Christ appeared. So the resurrection is rooted in testimony of eyewitnesses. You might just say the testimony of eyewitnesses. And interestingly, the lists of those eyewitnesses was part of the kerygma. Interesting, isn't it? It wasn't that Jesus rose from the dead. It's Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to Cephas and James, and then another place in the Acts of the Apostles, and 500 other people. The fourth point, the resurrection was an event that reverses death and burial. It might not sound like much, but that's an extremely important point that Paul's making. The resurrection reverses death and burial. You ever wonder why you hear that in the creed, and why does Paul say, why not just death? Like, he saved him from death. Who cares if he saved him from burial? Have you ever wondered that? I'll just leave that one hanging there, but we'll see how that gets resolved here. I'll let that percolate in your mind. Well, let me draw out one aspect of it. It's the same person. The same person who was buried rose from the dead. You don't bury spirits, you bury a body. So if he was buried and that same one who was buried rises from the dead, it's the same person. The continuity, it's the same person. It's not the creation of a new person. Okay, next point. What are we up to? 5? Okay, the resurrection is an objective event. Objective event. Meaning this. It has a cause outside of the people who experience the resurrection, the appearances. It's not a merely subjective event. That's built right into Paul's curriculum. And that's going to get attacked, and we'll look at it by some scholars, and we'll look at arguments for that. Sixth point, the resurrection of Jesus is a bodily event, though through a glorified, transformed body. What Paul calls a spiritual body. A spiritual body. He says that in a section in 1 Corinthians 15. So it's the same Jesus, it's the same body that was buried, but it's not merely the same body. It's now glorified, transformed. What Paul calls in Greek a soma pneumatikon. Soma is the Greek word for body. Pneumatikon, starting with a P, like pneumatikon, is the word for spiritual. And then lastly, the resurrection is not a normal historical event. So I think you can see that it's pretty clear Paul saying this happened, this is a historical event, but it's not a merely historical event, a normal historical event. Here's one way that Paul gets at this in other places. He refers to to seeing the Lord. So there it is, a historical phenomenon, objective phenomenon. I saw the Lord. You see a reference to that in Galatians, Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 1, verse 16. And also remember Paul's road to Damascus, recounted in the Acts of the Apostles, this blinding light, this seeing of the Lord, but he also refers to it as a revelation from God. Well, if I just saw a turtle, why would I call that like a revelation? You see what I'm saying? So there's a strangeness to this historical phenomenon. It's not merely historical. I would point out this. Nowhere in the historical data do we have a non-believer experiencing an appearance of the resurrected Christ. That's interesting, isn't it? It's only believers. We don't have any historical documents of Jesus appearing. Why didn't he appear to Pontius Pilate after he rose from the dead? Wouldn't that have been helpful? Maybe it has something to do with the nature of the event.